Have you ever stopped to think about how a nation can be divided to the point of getting into war against yourself? And, more importantly, how did the decisions of leaders and soldiers shape the future of millions? In this video, we will explore the decisive moments of the American Civil War, from the first shot fired at Fort Sumter to the strategies that defined the most bloody conflict in U.S. history. Watching this video will open your mind to understand not only historical events, but also the lessons of strategy, leadership, and resilience that still make a difference these days. If you seek to learn from past mistakes and triumphs to apply to your life, this is the right video for you. So stay with us. Are you prepared to unravel the secrets behind battles, decisions, and moments that have changed the fate of a nation? The American Civil War did not begin as an inevitable event, but as the apex of decades of latent tensions between the industrial North and agrarian South. When Abraham Lincoln assumed the presidency in 1860, the issue of slavery was already a barrel of gunpowder about to explode. The South, fearing that Lincoln's administration would restrict its economy based on enslaved labor, it has decided to act. This sense of urgency culminated in the secession of 11 states, which formed the Confederated States of America. Imagine tension in the runners of power in Washington, D.C., with each decision loaded with unpredictable consequences. The separation of states was much more than a geographical rupture. It was a collision of ideals. On the one hand, the North defended the preservation of the Union and, to a lesser extent, the abolition of slavery. On the other, the South saw secession as a struggle for sovereignty and maintaining its economy. This division was not something that had emerged overnight, but the result of years of heated debates in Congress and regional conflicts, such as the bloody episode of Bleeding Kansas. It was not just an American war, but a watershed to the fate of a nation. As the tensions grew, both sides prepared for the inevitable confrontation. But the question that permeated the minds of many was, who would give the first shot? Lincoln, a cautious strategist, knew that hasty action could alienate border states, while Jefferson Davis, Confederate president, believed that the initial force would consolidate its cause. This political chess game was far from simple, and movements made during this opening would define the tone for the next 4 years of war. The spirits finally overflowed when the Confederate forces decided to attack the strong Sumter. Before that, Washington nervously watched the climb, but did not act to avoid a fatal error. To understand the severity of the moment, think of a fight where both parties hesitate, but they know that as soon as the first punch is given, there will be no more return. This was the atmosphere in the spring of 1861, a point without return to the lock. The explosion of hostilities at Fort Sumter would mark the beginning of the American War, but the events that led there were already full of lessons about strategy and leadership. This initial phase serves as a reminder of how decisions and hesitation shape the direction of history. But after all, who was really prepared for the approaching storm? The strong Sumter, strategically located at the entrance of Charleston's port, became the epicenter of the first clash of the American Civil War. After the secession of South Carolina, the troops of the Union remained in the fort, challenging the newly deplanted sovereignty of the Confederates. It was like an uncomfortable symbol to the South, a reminder that total control was still out of reach. When the evacuation period expired and the negotiations failed, Jefferson Davis authorized the attack, triggering a bombing that lasted 2 days. The Confederates, under the command of General P.G.T. Beauregard, showed their determination from the beginning. With batteries positioned on land, they threw a shower of fire on the fort, forcing the Union troops to house and eventually surrendering. Imagine the vision: explosions illuminating the night sky, while Charleston's residents attended the show of their balconies as if it were a social event. It was a moment loaded with emotion and pride to the South, which saw the first victory as an omen of continuous success. To the North, however, the fall of Fort Sumter was a shock that galvanized his willingness to fight. Lincoln, realizing the severity of the attack, used the event as a call to action, calling volunteers to defend the Union. The episode also revealed the initial war strategies. The South opted for a decisive attack to affirm its position, while the North began to shape your long-term response. These choices would soon become the foundations for the strategic patterns that would mark the conflict. It is worth reflecting on the Southern choice of starting the attack. Although it was a symbolic triumph, it also assured that the North would respond in full force. This strategic decision can be compared to a chess player sacrificing a smaller piece to attract the opponent to the board. But, as we know, a brilliant opening does not always guarantee the final victory. The attack, although effective, lit the flame of an American war that would grow devastatingly. The impact of Fort Sumter was deep. It not only started the war, but also changed the political and military narrative on both sides. What seemed to be a controllable conflict quickly became a storm that would consume the nation. And so the question became inevitable. How would both sides deal with the initial mobilization for the greatest conflict in its history? With the attack on Fort Sumter marking the official beginning of the American Civil War, both sides moved quickly to gather their strength. Abraham Lincoln, in a speech that echoed throughout the North, called 75,000 volunteers to serve for 90 days, believing that the conflict would be short. This optimistic estimate was soon wrong, and the number increased to 115,000 as the magnitude of war became clear. On the other hand, Jefferson Davis responded with equal vigor, calling 100,000 men to defend the Confederated cause. The popular response, especially in the North, was overwhelming. Thousands of young people have enlisted, many motivated by a patriotic feeling of preserving the Union. In the South, the call of Davis aroused a similar fervor, with eager men to defend their land and lifestyle. It was fascinating to observe how propaganda played a key role. Newspapers, leaflets, and even songs exalted the duty to fight. However, the initial mobilization also revealed the logistics limitations on both sides, such as the lack of appropriate uniforms, supplies, and weapons. Border states have become a crucial point of dispute during this phase. Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland, divided between North and South loyalties, faced constant pressure to choose one side. Lincoln demonstrated strategic skill by using political and military measures to keep these states in the Union, while Confederates tried to gain local support. Think of the impact of decisions like this. A single region could alter the balance of power on the battlefield, making mobilization as political as it is military. The preparation for the American War also exposed the inexperience of many leaders and soldiers. In the makeshift training fields, common farmers and traders began learning military tactics. As officials on both sides, many of them Mexican-American war veterans were promoted to lead whole armies. However, the lack of coordination often resulted in chaos, with poorly organized troops and outdated weapons. This phase was a striking reminder that the war strategy did not depend only on numbers, but also on discipline, supplies, and leadership. As both sides accumulated forces, it was evident that this war would not be a brief or simple conflict. The initial fervor, fueled by fiery speeches and promises of victory, would soon find the harsh reality of the battlefield. The mobilization was just the beginning. The following strategies and plans would determine the course of the conflict. Thus, the question that hovered on both sides was, how to turn inexperienced soldiers into armies capable of overcoming decisive battles. The American Civil War was marked by military strategies that reflected both creativity and the limitations of its leaders. Among the most notable plans was the Anaconda Plan, proposed by General Winfield Scott. This strategy aimed at economically stifling Confederated states through a coastal block, control of the Mississippi River, and the protection of Washington, D.C. Although initially ridiculed by its ambition, the plan was partially implemented and played a significant role throughout the conflict. Naval block, for example, had a direct impact on the South economy. Without access to European markets to sell cotton or import weapons, the Confederates faced a growing shortage of supplies. Imagine what this meant to the soldiers in the field. Worn uniforms, lower weapons, and often lack of food. Meanwhile, the control of Mississippi began dividing the Confederated territories, making communication and sending reinforcements difficult. Strategies like this show how the American War was not just on the battlefield, but also behind the scenes. On the other hand, the South opted for a more defensive approach, betting on its territorial extension and determining its troops to wear out the North. Generals like Robert E. Lee believed that by overcoming key battles and maintaining resistance, they could force the North to seek an agreement. This type of strategy, known as the friction war, was effective on occasion, but required a level of resources that the South could not support. It is interesting to note how strategic decisions do not always generate the expected results when confronted with the brutal reality of war. Although the plans were fundamental, their execution depended on solid leaders and well-trained troops. Both sides have faced challenges in this area, such as the inexperience of many commanders and the psychological wear of the troops. The Battle of Big Bethel, for example, highlighted the Union's lack of coordination, resulting in a Confederated victory. This little confrontation served as a warning to the North. which would need to adjust your strategies quickly to avoid more humiliating defeats. The impact of initial strategies was clear. While the South tried to survive and protect its territory, the North sought to stifle its enemies and divide its forces. However, the first conflicts would soon show that no plan was above adaptations. The American War, after all, was a dynamic game where the ability to learn and react was as important as the initial strategy. But was the Union ready to face the coming battles, like the decisive Battle of Bull Run? The first great battle of the American Civil War, the Battle of Bull Run, revealed the harsh realities of the conflict. Held near the Bull Run stream in Virginia, this battle exposed the inexperience of both troops and Union commanders. General Irvin McDowell, leading the Northern forces, planned to capture the railway in Manassas to weaken Confederated mobility. It was an ambitious strategy, but the execution stumbled on the logistics challenges and the lack of discipline of the soldiers. In the battlefield, the confusion reigned. Union troops faced a fierce resistance led by Confederate generals Joseph E. Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard. Amid chaos, General Thomas Jackson earned the nickname Stonewall by positioning himself firmly against the attacks of the Union. Imagine the scene: Confederate soldiers, inspired by Jackson's determination, resisting as an impenetrable wall. This moment not only became the course of the battle, but also raised the Southern morale, turning the initial defeat into a significant victory. For the Northern audience, who expected a quick and decisive victory, Bull Run was a devastating shock. Civilians even traveled from Washington, D.C. to watch the battle as a show, just to witness the humiliating defeat of the Union. The panic that took over the Northern troops during the withdrawal was a clear reminder that this American war would be long and brutal. It was the beginning of a painful awakening to those who underestimated the resilience and preparation of the Southern. Meanwhile, the Confederates took advantage of victory to strengthen their morals and consolidate their strengths. The Battle of Bull Run showed that, although smaller in number, their troops had the advantage of knowing the ground and having experienced leaders. However, this victory also brought a false sense of security to the South, leading some to believe that the war could be won quickly, a perception that, as we know, would be tested in the following years. Bull Run was not only a weapon confrontation, but also a test of strategies, leadership, and determination. The lessons learned in this clash would shape the next steps on both sides. But while the North reorganized its forces and redefined its plans, internal tensions began to emerge, challenging Lincoln's leadership and the cohesion of the Union. What would happen when dissension began to corrode confidence in government? While the Union faced the Confederate forces on the battlefield, an equally challenging enemy arose within its own borders: internal dissension. Since the beginning of the U.S. war, Abraham Lincoln has faced fierce criticism of various sides of both allies and opponents. Censorship of correspondence, newspapers, and telegraphs was one of the president's strategies to control the narrative. But this measure generated distrust and accusations of authoritarianism. Imagine a country at war where even freedom of expression seemed threatened. That was the complex scenario that Lincoln needed to sail. In addition to censorship, Lincoln authorized arrests of pro-Confederated dissidents, which further divided public opinion. Some supported these actions as necessary for national security, while others saw a violation of fundamental freedoms. These internal challenges showed that the American war was not just locked in the trenches, she was also present in the minds and hearts of her citizens. For those who are curious about how governments deal with similar crises, it is worth observing the decisions made at other times of emergency, such as during World War I, when laws such as Espionage Act have also restricted civil liberties. Another point of conflict was the Act of Confiscation of 1861, which allowed the seizure of properties, including enslaved, belonging to Confederate rebels. This measure, in addition to weakening the South economically, created tensions between Northern factions. Abolitionists saw the act as a crucial step in ending slavery, while conservatives feared it was too far away and alienated the border states. Here, Lincoln's leadership showed his ability to balance divergent interests, but not without paying a high political price. Tensions were also reflected in Congress, where moderate Democrats and Republicans often conflict over the conduct of war. The criticism intensified after defeats like Bull Run, when opposing voices questioned the military's military competence. This environment of uncertainty brought challenges to Lincoln, which needed to unite a divided country while fighting to ensure the loyalty of states like Maryland and Kentucky. It was like walking over fine ice. Any false step could mean a disastrous fall. These internal dilemmas not only tested Lincoln's leadership, but also shaped the trajectory of the American war. Each decision had political and military implications, and the balance between security and freedom was constantly challenged. However, while Lincoln dealt with these conflicts, the battlefield was still the focus of attention, with new decisive struggles emerging on the horizon. What would be the next chapter of this troubled story? The first months of the American Civil War brought conflicts that defined the tone and complexity of the confrontation. The Battle of Wilson's Creek in August 1861 was the first major fight in the western Mississippi River. In this bloody combat, the Confederates won an important victory, but not without paying a high price at casualties. The battle highlighted the strategic importance of the West and showed that the American war would spread throughout the territory, challenging the logistics and military capabilities on both sides. Soon after, in September, the Confederates won Lexington, Missouri after days of bombing and intense fighting. The siege of the city was an example of how defensive strategies could be used effectively to obtain significant territorial gains. For many in the South, this victory was a symbol of resistance and courage, but also revealed the limitations of the Union forces in the protection of strategic areas in the West. This pattern of conflict shows how geography played a key role in American war, influencing the planning of each military movement. Another remarkable confrontation was the disaster in Ball's Bluff in October 1861. Union troops suffered a devastating defeat by trying to cross the Potomac River to attack a Confederated position. The result was absolute chaos, with many soldiers being pushed into the river, drowning, or being captured. This humiliating episode had a great political impact on Washington, leading to the creation of the War Conduct Committee, which sought to investigate and hold the commanders for flaws on the battlefield. Meanwhile, in the West, the strategic importance of the Mississippi River was beginning to shape the movements on both sides. The control of its waters was not only a matter of transportation, but also of dividing the Confederate territory. Confederate victories like Wilson's Creek were essential to maintaining high morale, but the growing northern pressure would soon turn this region into a critical battlefield. The American War, therefore, was not just a series of isolated battles, but an interconnected conflict where each victory and defeat influenced the next actions. These initial conflicts showed that the war would be long and unpredictable. The lessons learned in these clashes shaped future strategies, while the stories of courage and tragedy spread throughout the nation. But as 1861 came to an end, a new crisis arose, this time in the diplomatic field, which threatened to expand the U.S. war beyond the U.S. borders. How would the Lincoln government deal with this international tension? Amid the inner chaos of the American Civil War, a diplomatic crisis almost led the United States to an international confrontation. The incident became known as the Trent Case. In November 1861, the USS San Jacinto, a Union Navy ship, intercepted the British ship RMS Trent, which carried two Confederate sent, James Mason and John Slidell, towards Europe. These diplomats were on their way to seeking support for the Confederate cause, and their capture ran into the United Kingdom. It was like adding more wood to an uncontrollable fire. The British response was immediate and severe. Many in London saw action as a violation of neutrality and an affront to British sovereignty. Troops began to mobilize in Canada, and the possibility of a war between the United Kingdom and the United States hovered in the air. For the Union, this perspective was alarming. Fighting two fronts against the Confederates and a global power like the United Kingdom could mean the total collapse. The already complex American war threatened to become an international conflict. Lincoln and his counselors, aware of the devastating consequences of a confrontation with the British, opted for a diplomatic approach. After weeks of tense negotiations, the president ordered the release of the Confederate envoys, stating that the Union had no intention of offending the United Kingdom. This decision avoided climbing, but also brought internal criticism, especially those who saw the act as a demonstration of weakness. It was a calculated move, a strategy that reflected Lincoln's ability to balance priorities. The Trent case also had a psychological impact on the Confederates, who initially saw the incident as an opportunity to gain powerful allies in Europe. However, the Union's diplomatic ability ensured that the United Kingdom remained neutral, frustrating Southern hope for international recognition. This episode serves as a reminder that in times of war, political and diplomatic battles are as crucial as the battlefield waged. Although resolved, the crisis left profound marks on relations between the United States and the United Kingdom. It also highlighted the vulnerability of the Union in a globalized conflict, where each action could trigger unexpected consequences. With the incident ended, Lincoln's attention turned back to the battlefields and the struggle for the preservation of the Union. After all, the American War was far from over, and the internal and external challenges continued to accumulate. And now, do you understand how each battle in 1861 was a brick that built the foundations of the American Civil War? More than historical facts, these conflicts show how strategic decisions and courage shape the future of a nation. But the question that remains is, how can these lessons be applied to your life? Would you have the resilience to face the challenges of the time? Which of these battles impacted you the most? If you were intrigued by these stories and want to know more about the moments that defined the history of American wars, don't stop here. The next chapter is full of new lessons and strategies that can turn the way you see the past and even the present. So subscribe to the American War channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any details of this series. The story doesn't stop here, and you shouldn't. Participate in the comments and say what impressed you most. Perhaps your doubt or opinion does not become the theme of the next video. We are just starting this epic journey.